Everyone at that county auction laughed when a quiet man paid $47 for a strip of dirt nobody else wanted. 50 years later, a $40 million project sat frozen because of it, and only he knew why. The call came at 6:52 in the morning, and the developer's lawyer was already shouting before anyone said hello. The whole site is dead, frozen. We cannot move a single truck until this is fixed. His name was Marcus Vail, and he had built things for 30 years. Office towers, a stadium, a bridge across a river 2 states wide. He had been stopped by strikes and storms and money that dried up overnight. He had never been stopped by 12 feet of dirt. He set the phone down and stared at the survey on his desk in the gray morning light. A logistics terminal, $40 million. 280 acres bought and paid for, every one of them his on paper. And cutting straight through the only road in, a thin strip no wider than a hallway, drawn on the map like a scar nobody had bothered to explain. The strip had a name on the deed. Not a company, not a trust. A man, Elmer Pruitt. Buy him out, Marcus said into the phone. These old men always sell. They sell to pay a hospital bill. They sell to leave their kids something. They sell because they're tired. Find the reason and write the check. The voice on the other end went quiet. We tried, it said. He said no, Marcus laughed. He had heard no 1,000 times. No was just the first number in a long conversation. Everybody has a price, not this one. We offered 10 times the value. He didn't even let us finish the sentence. Marcus stopped laughing. 10 times the value was not a no. 10 times the value was a man who knew something. Not this one, the voice said again, quieter. Pagosa County Fairgrounds. October 1973. A folding table sat in the middle of a cold room. A coffee pot hissed on a side table, the only warm thing in the building. 26 metal chairs were lined up in rows, most of them empty. A few filled with men who had come for the good land and would leave the moment the good land was gone. Elmer Pruitt sat in the back. He was 31. He wore the same brown coat he wore everywhere, and he kept his hands folded in his lap, and he watched. The auctioneer moved fast, the way they do when most of what they're selling is worth selling. Bottomland sold to a dairyman who needed it. A timber lot sold to 2 brothers who bid against each other until they both looked foolish. 40 acres near the new highway sold for real money, and the men who bought it nodded at each other like they had won something, because they had. Then the auctioneer reached the bottom of his list, where the leftovers lived. Lot 9, he said. He squinted at the page, turned it toward the light, squinted again, as if the words might mean more on a second reading. 12 feet wide, half a mile long, floodplain on the south end, no road in, no road out. County's got it marked non-buildable. He looked up at the room. Anybody? Anybody at all? Nobody moved. A chair creaked. Somebody coughed. The coffee pot hissed. Elmer raised one finger, not a hand. One finger, like a man answering a question he already knew the answer to. A man near the front turned around to look, slow, the way you turned to see who would do a thing like that. His name was Carl Henning, and he worked at the bank that held paper on half the county, which made him feel like he owned the other half. He had a loud voice and a louder laugh, and he used both freely because no one had ever made him pay for either. $47, the auctioneer said, and the number hung in the cold air like a joke waiting for someone to laugh. Carl obliged. He leaned to the man beside him. He did not bother to whisper. There's Pruitt, Carl said, buying the one piece you couldn't give away. $47 for a ditch that floods. He shook his head, delighted. Some men just can't help themselves. The men around him laughed, the easy laugh of people glad it wasn't them. Elmer did not turn around. He did not change his face. He let the laughter wash over the back of his neck, and he kept his eyes on the front of the room, where his land was being written into his name. He walked to the front and signed the paper. The pen was nearly dry, and he had to press hard. He counted out $47 in small bills onto the folding table, smoothing each one flat, taking his time, while the room watched and thought it was watching a fool. The auctioneer handed him a receipt. Elmer folded the receipt into 4 neat squares, the creases sharp under his thumb. He slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, over his heart. Then he walked out past Carl Henning, who was still grinning, still warm with the pleasure of another man's mistake. Enjoy your swamp, Elmer, Carl called after him. Elmer touched the brim of his hat and kept walking, out into the cold, bright afternoon, and he did not look back. He did not tell Carl what he had read 3 weeks earlier. He did not tell anyone, because a thing that everyone knows is worth nothing, and a thing that one man knows can be worth a great deal, if that man can keep his mouth shut and his face still. In the basement of the county library, on a roll of microfilm nobody had asked to see in years, Elmer had found a map. He had been looking for something else entirely, a property line, a fence dispute, the kind of small, dull thing that filled his evenings. The film had slipped past the page he wanted, and he had wound it back, and there it was. An old plan, drawn by the state in a careful hand, stamped and dated, and then, somewhere along the way, forgotten. A road that was supposed to be built and then was not. Money ran out, or men changed their minds, or the war came. The reason did not matter. What mattered was that the plan was dead and the easement it described was not. The road had a route. The route ran down a thin line between two big parcels, the only firm ground across the floodplain, the one place a road could ever go. Lot 9. He drove home slowly that day, the way he drove when his mind was full. The truck smelled like cold coffee and old paper, and the heater worked only when it wanted to, and the road home unspooled in front of him while the map unspooled behind his eyes. His wife was waiting on the porch when he pulled in, a sweater pulled tight around her shoulders against the evening cold. Her name was Ruth. She had a way of reading him before he spoke, of knowing from the set of his shoulders whether the day had gone his way. "Well," she said. "Got it," Elmer said. "How much?" $47. Ruth folded her arms and leaned against the post. "And the men? Did they laugh?" "Some." She studied his face the way she always did, looking for the thing underneath the words. "And you let them?" "Cost nothing to let a man laugh." Elmer climbed the steps and took the folded receipt from his coat and set it on the kitchen table, smoothing it flat with one finger, the way he had smoothed the bills onto the auctioneer's table. Costs him plenty later sometimes. Ruth did not fully understand. She knew the strip was worthless, knew the county had said so in writing, knew the whole town would have the story by morning. But she trusted the look in his eyes, because she had seen it before, over a calf nobody wanted that grew into their best milker, over a stretch of fence everyone said would never hold, and it had never once been wrong. She put the coffee on. Elmer sat at the table for a long time after she went to bed. The house was dark and still, the kind of still where you can hear the clock in the next room and the wind testing the windows. He unfolded the receipt and read it again, though he knew every word, though he could have recited it with his eyes closed. $47, Lot 9, his name in his own pressed hard hand. He thought about the map in the library basement, the careful lines of a road that existed only on film and in his memory now. He thought about how a thing can be true on paper for 50 years before anyone needs it to be true in the dirt. He thought about how land has a memory, even when the people who drew the lines are gone, even when the men who laughed are gone, even when everyone has forgotten there was ever anything there at all. The men at the auction saw a swamp, a ditch, a joke worth telling at the bar. Elmer saw a door, and he had just bought the only key and folded it into 4 neat squares and put it over his heart. He folded the receipt one more time and put it back in his coat. He turned off the lamp, and the kitchen went dark, and the clock ticked on in the next room. Somewhere across the county, in a warm bar with the lights still on, Carl Henning was telling the story of the fool who paid good money for a ditch, and the whole room was laughing, and Carl was buying the next round on the strength of it. Elmer slept fine, because he knew one thing that no one else in that room had bothered to learn, and he was patient enough to wait for the rest of the world to catch up. Before this gets even crazier, do that quiet man a favor and hit subscribe, because what looks like a swamp today turns into the most patient trap you have ever seen, and Act 2 is where he sets it. April 1973, 6 months before the auction. A reading room with green lamps and a film reader that hummed like a tired fan. Elmer Pruitt came in to read about a tractor recall. He left 3 hours later thinking about a road. He had pulled the wrong roll of film by accident. The drawers were labeled in a hand that had faded years ago, and the roll he wanted sat one slot over from the roll he took. State Planning Records, 1956. Most men would have noticed the mistake, sighed, and put it back. Elmer threaded it into the reader because it was already in his hand, and reading was free, and he had driven a long way for the tractor recall and saw no reason to waste the trip. He read it cover to cover, the way he read everything, slowly, one finger under each line. The fan hum of the reader filling the quiet room, the green lamp throwing its tired light across the page. That was where he found it. In 1956, the state had drawn a plan for a new road. A corridor, they called it, which was a fine word for a thing that did not yet exist. It would connect the highway on the west to the rail yard on the east side of the county, cutting a clean line through ground that nobody was using for much of anything. The plan was approved, the route was surveyed, stake by stake. The land was set aside in the county's own books, marked and reserved and waiting for the work to begin. Then the money ran out the way money does, and the road was never built. Elmer read the last page twice. He was looking for one word, and he knew exactly what it was, and he ran his finger down the page slowly to be sure he did not miss it. Cancelled. The word was not there. The plan had been shelved, set aside, forgotten by every soul who had ever touched it. But it had never been legally canceled, and that was a different thing entirely. On paper, in the county's own filing, that corridor was still alive, still reserved, still waiting for someone to remember it. And the route ran down a 12-foot line between 2 larger parcels. Elmer sat very still for a moment. Then he took a scrap of paper from his coat and wrote down the lot number in his careful hand. Lot 9. He went back the next day, and the day after that. He pulled tax maps and zoning sheets and easement filings, stacking them on the long oak table until the clerk began to wonder what a quiet farmer wanted with so much paper. He said nothing, because a man who explains himself gives away the only thing worth keeping. He cross-checked the 1956 route against the current county plat, laying one over the other, tracing both lines with his finger. The line matched. Foot for foot, it matched. The corridor the state had drawn 17 years ago ran straight down the middle of a strip that the county now called worthless, non-buildable floodplain on the south end. Two truths about the same dirt, and only one of them was written where anyone bothered to look. He paid the clerk 40 cents to make a copy of the 1956 filing. He folded it into quarters, the creases sharp under his thumb, and put it in the same coat pocket as the rest of his life. His license, a few folded bills, a list in Ruth's hand of things to buy in town. He drove home slow. The truck smelled like cold coffee and old paper, and the heater worked when it pleased, and the whole way back his mind ran along that 12-foot line east toward the rail yard, the way water runs downhill once it finds the channel. When he came in, Ruth was at the stove. The kettle was just beginning to whistle low, the way it does before it finds its full voice. "You've been gone 3 days running," she said, not turning around. "A man doesn't read about a tractor for 3 days. "No," Elmer agreed. "He doesn't." He took a sheet of butcher paper from the roll by the door and laid it flat on the kitchen table, smoothing it with the side of his hand. He found a pencil. Then he drew. A long, thin rectangle, half a mile of it pressed into a foot of paper. 2 big squares on either side pressing in. And an arrow at the end pointing east toward the rail yard he had only ever seen from the highway. Ruth turned the burner down and came to look over his shoulder, drying her hands on her apron. She studied the drawing the way she studied his face, looking for the thing underneath it. "That's the ditch," she said, "the one out past the Hennings. The one the county won't let anybody build on. That's the one. And these," she touched the 2 big squares. "Those'll have somebody on them someday," Elmer said. "Somebody who needs to get across. And there's only one place to cross." He set the pencil down on the line in the middle. "Right here." Ruth looked at the drawing a long while. The kettle climbed toward its whistle behind her. "And nobody else knows," she said. "Nobody else read the wrong roll of film," Elmer said. "And nobody else stayed to finish it." She did not fully understand it, the corridor, the word that wasn't there, the 17 years of dust. But she understood the look on his face, because she had seen it before, and it had never once been wrong. She took the kettle off the heat before it could scream. Elmer sat at the table after she went to bed, the butcher paper still spread in front of him, and looked at the long, thin line until the lamp was the only light left in the house. Ruth came over, wiping her hands on a towel. "What is it?" she asked. "A road that doesn't exist yet," Elmer said. She looked at the map. She looked at him. "Will it ever?" "Someday," he said, "when everything around it fills up. Then somebody will need it bad." That was all he said. Ruth did not push. She set a cup of tea by his elbow and let him draw. Over the next months, Elmer watched. He drove the back road past Lot 9 twice a week. He noticed things other men did not. A survey flag near the south corner. Then 3 more, fresh tire tracks where there had been none. A truck with a company name he did not know. He started a notebook. Ruth had given it to him for his birthday, small and black, with a hard cover. He had never known what to use it for. Now he did. He wrote down dates. He wrote down the company names off the trucks. When a parcel near Lot 9 sold, he drove to the courthouse and read who bought it. The buyer was never a person. It was always a company with a flat, empty name, Eastgate Holdings, then Eastgate 2, then Corridor Land Partners. The same money, wearing different coats. Year after year, the companies bought. 40 acres here, 60 there, a failed farm, a gravel pit. They were stitching the land together, one quiet purchase at a time, and they were doing it so slowly that nobody in town noticed the pattern. Nobody but Elmer. He spread his map on the kitchen table one winter night and marked every purchase in pencil. The big squares were filling in. 280 acres, almost whole now, wrapped around a thin gap in the middle. The gap was Lot 9. They had bought everything around it. They had bought it for years. And they had never once bought the one piece in the center, because the county still listed it as a worthless floodplain ditch. Elmer set his pencil down. He understood it now, all the way down. A man can own 280 acres and still be trapped if he cannot get a truck to it. And there was only one legal way in, one route the law still recognized. One strip of dirt that a road had been promised to 67 years ago and never released from. He had bought that strip for $47. Ruth stood in the doorway in her robe. She looked at the map, at the pencil marks, at her husband's still face. "They don't know yet," she said. "Not a question." "No," Elmer said. He closed the notebook. He looked at the hand-drawn map one last time, at the small, empty gap in the middle of all that careful pencil. The trap was already built. It had been built in 1973. Now he only had to wait for someone to walk into it. The knock came on a Tuesday in spring. Elmer set his coffee cup down on the kitchen table before he stood to answer it. A young man stood on the porch in a pressed gray suit. He held a clipboard against his chest like a shield. He smiled too wide. "Mr. Pruitt? I represent some buyers interested in your Lot 9 parcel." Elmer held the door halfway open. "It's not for sale. You haven't heard the number yet." The young man slid a paper from his clipboard. $8,000. For a strip you can't even build on. "That's a generous offer, sir. $8,000. For dirt that costs $47,000. Elmer looked at the paper for a moment. Then he handed it back. "Thank you for driving out," he said. "No." The young man blinked. He had clearly expected this to be easy. "Sir, I don't think you understand what this is worth." "I understand fine," Elmer said. "Drive safe." He closed the door gently and went back to his coffee. The years had taught him a rhythm, and he kept to it. Twice a year he mowed the strip so the markers stayed clear. Every spring he drove to the courthouse and paid the tax bill, which had crept from $4 to $9 to $19 over the decades. He paid it in cash on time every single year, and he kept every receipt folded in the same coat pocket as the first one. Most of the county forgot Lot 9 existed. Elmer never did. The second offer came by phone, 2 years after the first, a county official this time. A smooth, careful voice that used words like infrastructure and public benefit. "We'd like to acquire the parcel for planned right-of-way," the voice said. "We're prepared to offer $60,000. Ruth was sitting across the table, shelling peas. She did not look up, but her hands slowed. "That's a lot of money," the voice added, when Elmer said nothing. "It is," Elmer agreed. "No, thank you." He hung up. Ruth looked at him then. "One short question. You sure?" "They're asking for the county," Elmer said. "But the county doesn't need a road there. Somebody told them to ask, somebody behind them." He picked up a pea pod. "When the right one comes, he'll come himself." Ruth nodded once and went back to shelling. She had stopped needing the long version a long time ago. There was a memory Elmer carried from the year their daughter turned 12. Her name was Sarah. She had come with him to mow the strip one summer afternoon, riding in the truck with her bare feet on the dash. "Daddy, why do we keep this dumb piece of land?" she had asked. "It's just weeds." Elmer had smiled. "Because someday it won't be," he said. "And the people who own paper get to decide what happens. The people who lose it just get told." Sarah had rolled her eyes the way 12-year-olds do. But she had remembered it. Years later, in a different room, she would prove she remembered every word. Across town in a glass building Elmer never saw, a different kind of meeting was happening. Marcus Vale stood at the head of a long table. His engineers would not meet his eyes. "One strip," Marcus said. "One. Tell me again why a $40 million project is sitting on one man's 12 feet of weeds." A lawyer cleared his throat. "Because it's the only legal access, sir. The 1956 corridor, we've checked every other route. They all fail." Marcus pinched the bridge of his nose. "Then offer him more. Offer him whatever he wants. We've offered twice. Then I'll send you, in person. Nobody says no forever." The third offer arrived the following month, and this time it came in a 3-piece suit. The lawyer parked a black car in the gravel drive and carried a leather briefcase to the door. Elmer let him in. Ruth poured coffee at the kitchen table, because that was the polite thing to do, and the Pruitts were always polite. The lawyer opened the briefcase. He laid out papers like a man dealing cards. "Mr. Pruitt, my client is prepared to offer $400,000 for the Lot 9 parcel, cash. Closing in 30 days. $400,000. The number sat in the small kitchen like a stranger. Ruth did not gasp. She refilled the lawyer's cup. Elmer looked at the papers for a long, quiet moment. He thought about the auction, the folding table, the laugh. He thought about a road drawn in 1956 and never set free. "That's a fair offer," he said finally. "For a sale," the lawyer smiled, relieved. "Then we have a deal?" "No," Elmer said. "I'm not selling. Not for $400,000. Not for $4 million. The smile fell off the lawyer's face. He packed his briefcase slowly, the way a man does when he has run out of moves and is afraid to go back and say so. "You'll regret this," he said at the door. "Maybe," Elmer said. "Drive safe." He watched the black car kick up dust down the road. Then the offers stopped. For 4 months, nothing. No calls, no knocks, no suits. Elmer kept mowing, kept paying the tax, kept the markers clear. And on a quiet Thursday morning, while the coffee was still brewing, the phone rang. The screen showed a number Elmer did not know. He looked at it for 1 ring, 2. Then he reached for the receiver. "We need to discuss your land," the lawyer said, the moment Elmer lifted the receiver. "My client is willing to revisit our offer. Substantially." Elmer poured his coffee with free hand. "I'm listening," he said. $1 million, the lawyer said. "We can have papers drawn by Friday." $1 million. For a strip a man had paid $47 for 50 years before. That's a big number, Elmer said. It's still a sale, I told you. I don't sell. He set the phone down before the lawyer finished his next sentence. Then he called his daughter. Sarah drove down that weekend. She was 41 now, and a property lawyer in the city, and she did not waste time. She spread the permit file across the kitchen table, next to the original deed and the small black notebook her mother had given her father a lifetime ago. She read in silence for an hour. Ruth sat with her, not speaking. Then Sarah looked up. Dad, she said, the 1956 corridor. It was never formally vacated, was it? No, Elmer said. And you've paid the tax every year. Every single year, every spring. We need to discuss your land, the lawyer said, the moment Elmer lifted the receiver. My client is willing to revisit our offer. Substantially. Elmer poured his coffee with his free hand. I'm listening, he said. $1 million, the lawyer said, today. We can have papers drawn by Friday. $1 million. For a strip a man had paid $47 for 50 years before. That's a big number, Elmer said. It's still a sale, I told you. I don't sell. He set the phone down before the lawyer finished his next sentence. Then he called his daughter. Sarah drove down that weekend. She was 41 now and a property lawyer in the city, and she did not waste time. She spread the permit file across the kitchen table, next to the original deed and the small black notebook her mother had given her father a lifetime ago. She read in silence for an hour. Ruth sat with her, not speaking, refilling the same cup of tea twice. Then Sarah looked up. Dad, she said, the 1956 corridor. It was never formally vacated, was it? No, Elmer said. And you've paid the tax every year, every single year, every spring. Sarah sat back. She remembered a hot afternoon and bare feet on a dashboard. The people who own paper get to decide. They can't touch you, she said quietly. And I don't think they know that yet. They found out in a county hearing room 3 months later. Vale's lawyers came with a thick file and a confident plan. They argued the strip had been abandoned, unused, worthless. They argued the old deed was invalid, the parcel forfeit, the access theirs by default. They talked for 40 minutes. They had charts. They had a man in a good suit who pointed at a screen. Sarah waited until they finished. Then she stood and placed 3 documents on the table, one at a time. The 1956 corridor filing, she said. Approved, surveyed. Never legally canceled. She set down the second. The county's own records showing no resolution to vacate it. Ever. She set down the third. A thick stack, held together with a rubber band that had gone soft with age. And 63 years of paid tax receipts on this parcel. You cannot abandon land you have paid taxes on every year for half a century. The county itself accepted every payment every spring without fail. She looked at Vale's lead lawyer. My father didn't forget this land. You did. The room was silent. The judge looked at the 3 documents. He looked at the thick stack of receipts. He did not need long. The judge ruled in under a minute. The deed stood. The access stood. The challenge was dead. Marcus Vale's lawyer did not argue. He did not gather his charts. He reached for his phone. The deal that followed was not a sale. Elmer refused the lump sum one final time. He set terms instead. A permanent easement. A monthly payment of $9,000 for the use of the strip adjusted every year for inflation. Transferable to his heirs after him. The road would run. The trucks would roll. And every month for the rest of his life and Ruth's and Sarah's, the money would come. The lawyer pushed back once, then twice, then he accepted every term. Elmer never raised his voice through any of it. He did not need to. The man who waits the longest sets the price. Sarah made the final call to Vale's office herself. Her voice stayed flat and calm against a panic she could hear rising on the other end of the line. When it was done, she called her father from the courthouse steps. It's done, Dad, she said. All of it. Good girl, Elmer said. Ruth, across the kitchen, simply put the kettle on. The signing happened at the county clerk's office, the same building where Elmer had paid $47 in the fall of 1973. He signed his name slow. He shook no hands. He folded his copy into 4 neat squares, the way he always had, and slid it into his coat pocket beside the first receipt he had carried for 50 years. In the truck afterward, he opened the small black notebook to the last page. Below 63 years of tax figures, in his careful hand, he wrote 4 words. The land remembered. Good. He closed the notebook and drove home. Marcus Vale read about the agreement in the local paper a week later. He made no comment. He gave no interview. There was only silence where his confidence used to be. And in a bar across the county, an old man who had laughed at the auction in 1973 heard the story and set down his glass. Well, he muttered, I'll be damned. The financial fight ended in monthly checks. The legal fight ended in 1 minute. The old laughter ended in that single line at the bar. And the long wait ended the only way it could, with a kettle on the stove and a wife who never once asked why. Some men spend their whole lives chasing the big loud win. Elmer Pruitt bought a quiet one for $47 and waited 50 years for it to walk up his porch and ask permission. So tell me, would you have grabbed that $1 million check and walked away? Or would you have held the line for the monthly deal like Elmer did? Drop your answer in the comments, and if patience like his earned a nod from you, subscribe for the next one.